Hi, everybody. Thanks for being here. I wanted to start with what is the purpose that we see that we should be getting with agile transformation, because we want to be thinking about this. If we talk about kind of stagnation, the idea is, well, what are we not getting to that we're trying to? And what we found is the five most important things that CXOs are interested in are maximizing ROI, reducing risk, reducing waste, learn how to learn to become better, and also to create alignment. So people are working on the same thing. What I've seen, and I've actually, I guess, seen this for the last few years, but it became particularly apparent to me. I did two one-day courses called Taking Agile to the Next Level, which kind of assumes pretty much you're already doing Agile at scale, and then it kind of fills in the gaps. And what I saw there was that a lot of people who have undertaken large scale agile transformations, almost regardless of what approach they were taking, seem to make progress at the beginning and then it kind of stagnates. So that's kind of what this talk is about, is why does that happen? Because even though the companies are quite different, the causes of the stagnation, or rather I should say first, the symptoms of the stagnation, and then the causes seem to be fairly consistent across many different organizations. So one thing we see is like teams do improve. People are getting better. They spin up Scrum teams, and things look like they're going better, but you don't really get time to market reduce. So it's like, well, people seem to be improving, but we're not getting what we started this for. We also sometimes see that not everything built is useful. We still kind of have this requirements change, which is, of course, always going to happen. The problem is, have you built the requirements before they change? Then that's a waste of time. If you hear requirements but you haven't built them yet, sometimes if they change, it really doesn't matter. And this notion that things almost get done, but finishing them, and by that I mean finishing them could be finishing them technically, it could be finishing them from a deployment point of view, it could be finishing them from a support point of view. The focus on a lot of large scale transformations are more about the IT or the dev group. And yet for business value to be delivered, as you know, there's a lot more than just the code, than just the systems. There's a lot of support work, there's a lot of marketing, there are a lot of pieces that need to be finished, and yet those sometimes seem to take a while. And DevOps is an improvement because now we're getting developers and operations talking to each other. But very often we find it's just that last quarter mile, so to speak, is where all the time takes. Lots of integration errors, things of that nature. So the question is, how do we improve that? And there are also lots of interruptions or waiting. And by that I mean, you have all these great grandiose plans for, say, like a year or something. And then something important comes in and you either have to wait for it because you got all this stuff jamming the pipeline, or you have to interrupt it, in which case you got to wonder, well, why did I make all these great plans in the first place? I'm sure there are other reasons, but it seems to be that the problems are we've made improvements, but we haven't quite got to the point we want to be, which is really faster delivery. So a tendency is when we look at what's causing stagnation is we're like, well, maybe you're doing the wrong process. So this kind of gets people out of waterfall sometimes and into, agile. But agile at the team level is considerably different than agile at the organizational level. In fact, I have on our YouTube Net Objective site a few minutes where I talk about why starting Scrum, just for the Scrum team, isn't actually a useful thing at times. It can actually cause problems. So we don't want to just do Scrum. What we want to do is actually look at the whole thing. So we might change process. We might decide that what we want to do is go to, like, say, for less or Nexus or one of the things, but then that doesn't seem to work. So we kind of say, well, maybe the development group isn't doing it right, or maybe they're not doing the process right. And then, developers, I hear a lot say, well, maybe it's management. If they'd only let us if they'd only let us do what we need to do, that would work. So there's this thing that people are looking for someone to blame. And this is ironic, but this happens both in waterfall and in agile. In waterfall, it's kind of like if people would just follow the plan, or people would say, well, management can't tell us what to do. And in agile, you're still looking at people. And this is an interesting thing because people are very important. There's no question about it. But to make a difference, we actually have to shift to a focus on the system. This is actually the big insight on lean. is that you have to take an holistic approach. You have to look at everything. Now, ideally, you would actually work with the entire system. Very often, you got one of two choices. Sometimes the business side, business product management, maybe the CEO or somebody wants to start and go agile, and you can actually start there. And sometimes the transformations begin at the development or IT side. Now, it's actually interesting because part of the problem is that you even have sides. In other words, there really shouldn't be a business side and there really shouldn't be a development or IT side, but in reality, that's what happens. Or most organizations have something like that. So I'm going to talk about pragmatically that what I've seen in most cases is we either start with like the business stakeholders or we start on the development or IT side. But in fact, that's actually a symptom of a bigger problem, which is a lack of alignment between the two. So I want to be clear that we understand, even though I'm talking about it this way, this isn't really the ideal situation. It's just the reality. So I'm going to start with the business side first. And by this, I mean, how can we make improvements by improving the way we give work to the development and IT side? Okay. And the obvious one is only work on high value work. There are a lot of features that aren't of highest value. There's a phenomenon I call getting while the getting is good, which I'm sure a lot of you have experienced. So when the budget comes up and you have the opportunity to do something, you actually get it started, and you pretty much ask for everything you need. And the challenge with this is, of course, you find that a lot of features are never used, and only a few are always used. So if we define everything at once, we never really get to discover what are these most important features, and then these most important features, and then these, and maybe we stop building after we get to these. And a lot of stuff's never used because at one time it was asked for, but it was misunderstood and something else was built. So people look at this slide and they say, well, that can't be us. But in fact, when you investigate it, there's more stuff in your system that's probably not being used than you would care to admit. So this is a question of effectiveness. Are we working on the right things? So there's this concept in the lean startup called minimum viable products that a lot of people use. But most companies that are doing large-scale agile transformations aren't startups, by definition. So we're really not trying to build something that is to discover if this is a good product or not, which is the idea of the lean startup MVP. But what we're actually trying to do is build something of high value that's the smallest thing we can actually deliver that makes sense. In other words, we call these the minimum business increment. In other words, what is the minimum amount of business value that can be built, deployed, and consumed? Because if it's not consumed, there's no value to it. It makes sense from a business perspective. Now, there are a couple things about this wording right away that's of interest. First of all, it didn't say the smallest thing you could deliver. It said, what's the smallest increment that makes sense from a business perspective, which means if it has to be marketed, if it has to have a certain minimal amount of functionality, if it has to have a certain level of support, whatever that is, if it doesn't make sense from a business perspective, then it's not an MBI. It's got to be something that actually has all the wrappings it's needed. So sometimes some companies can't deliver weekly, even if they can build it weekly, then an MBI wouldn't be a week. So it's from a business perspective. But the other key word there is this notion of consumed. In other words, if the customer, internal or external, can't consume it, it's not a business value. Now, I'm not saying that there's not value in incrementally building things to get feedback and to enable things to swarm, but business value typically happens if it's some functionality you're writing. It typically happens when you actually get the customer to use it, again, internal, external. So we want to start thinking about this because most development groups and IT groups think totally about what they're building instead of how does this thing get consumed. If we go back to the original idea that it almost gets there but then kind of slows down, the thing is it's that last mile, last quarter mile, whatever it is often, you'll notice, not dev or IT stuff. So we've got to start considering that's actually a very important thing. Now, another thing to consider is that we're not talking about an MBI is to get less, it's to deliver sooner. In other words, what we're trying to do is if we have, say, like a 6-month project, we want to break it down into like maybe there's something we can release in a couple of months, and then we can see if that's enough. Maybe we keep going, and maybe we don't. Or maybe we take feedback on things. The concept is I'm not just looking at what's the smallest thing I can deliver. I'm looking maybe at the target market. Who's my most important customer? What is the area I'm trying to penetrate the most? What's most valuable? And then I look at that chunk and I use that to define everything else underneath it. All too often we use epics. And the challenge with epics is because they're really like large stories. That's what an epic is. The problem with an epic is it's kind of vague and you might pull features out, but they're not delimited by, well, what's this chunk of value I'm trying to deliver? So if you want to use epics, then the idea is pull an MBI out of an epic. Because in reality, agility is about business value increments, not the development cycles, although we tend to focus on it because the development group has it last, so it's obviously their fault, but that's a joke. But obviously we need to worry about what's the business value increment. I don't care if you call it an MVP or an MBI or an MMF, minimum marketable feature, a lot of different names, but the idea is you have to pick what's valuable. You have to then align around it. That's the key piece. And you have to deliver incrementally. So this is really the idea. So, well, how do we do this? Well, one piece I'm going to do throughout this talk is I'm going to be sometimes putting up these little hexagons, and I'll talk about the total of them that I do at the end. But we have to agree that what we're going to do is drive from business value. And by that, I mean everybody agrees. In other words, if you can't see why something is of business value, you should ask the question, well, why is this a business value? Why are we doing this? This is true for product management, product owners, the teams, testers. We have to understand. And if I can't see why that is, then we have a challenge. So this is actually one of 6 guardrails, as we call them at Net Objectives. It's a guardrail because you can do what you want as long as it's, yeah, I can see we're driving from business value. And we'll see as these go on. Now, another easy way, and this actually maybe it's not that easy because you got to get people aligned to it, but it's a straightforward thing you can do, is to have shorter planning cycles. By that, I mean, have shorter chunks. So if you can get your projects to be under 3 months, and an MBI typically will be that, not always, but you can always get them smaller. You can't always have something deliverable in a short period of time. Like, I joke, I say if you're writing a flight control system for an airplane, you can't say, well, we're going to get it to turn left in the first month and then we'll get it to turn right in the next month. So some things cannot be decomposed and actually deployed and consumed. But you could, of course, simulate it. You can always usually build it for testing. So what's interesting is to just notice if you have annual planning cycles, say from you stop taking input in October. So from October to December, you actually say, I'm not taking any new ideas. We're doing our planning in October through December. That means your input stage was probably stopped. On average will be, sometime between October and October. That'd be like March. And that's going to be when, on average, your ideas came in March and they didn't get completed until, on average, in June the next year. So you're going to have a 15-month on average month to deliver. So what happens, of course, is nobody's going to wait that long for important things. This is why with annual cycles, you always get stuff squeezed in because it's just a huge amount of time. Whereas if you can go to quarterly planning cycles, you actually can, take the month before and a month or two before the quarter to make sure you got your input. You can plan. And on average, you're done in the middle of the quarter. And you can literally drop your average time of delivery to 3 months just by changing the planning cycles. Now, this is usually not straightforward because it goes back to how you finance things, and I don't have time to go through the financing, how you manage financing in Agile, although that sounds like it would be a good topic for conversation, maybe another blog, and certainly you can contact me if you're interested in that. But that is, the funding model is often one of the real impediments we have on the business side, so I acknowledge that. So anyway, I'm going to switch over to the development/IT side, which again is now a different question. In other words, I would suggest that the business side is more about effectiveness. Are we actually suggesting the right things? IT has also effectiveness because we have to do things like acceptance test-driven development or behavioral-driven development. And in doing that, we can get more clear about what we really need to build. But there is also an efficiency aspect to it. And this is something we really, really need to understand. Because we often just say things like, if we talk about lean, we hear things like eliminate waste. But it's sometimes hard to see waste in software. Software is not the physical world. Like if you're building a car in a manufacturing line, you make a mistake, you can see the bumper on the floor that you had to take off or something like that. In software, you can't see the waste as clearly, but you can see the cause of waste, which I'm going to suggest are delays. And where do these delays come from? Okay, so well, let's take a look at that, because this is part of the holistic thing we have to look at. What is the common organizational structure most companies have? It's some type of vertical alignment, typically, like marketing, product management, development, support. We have something like that. But it's interesting to notice that the nature of our work doesn't go in these nice silos, but rather something comes in, we get an idea, should we do it? It goes across into the development or IT organization. So we have this dichotomy, in a sense, that the nature of our work runs across the organization. And yet we manage kind of from more of a top-down approach in the organization. So we manage one way, and the workflow is another way. In fact, this is part of the challenge, is this disconnect. And the question is, who's managing the value? Now, the reason we're going to every now and then have a little Tasktop icon up there is just, this is actually part of the value of having tools that are integrated across the value stream, because you're otherwise segmented. This also explains, by the way, why if I start an Agile project by working on a team here or working on a team here, I'm not really working across the organization, so I'm not necessarily going to get a whole lot of improvement. So what we want to look at is, what are we really trying to do? Who's managing this value? And what we're really trying to do is improve the time to market. So what I did here is I just took the people out and said, let's look at the workflow. This is what's called the value stream. Okay, now again, people are very important. They're the ones who are doing the work. We need to respect them. But when we look at the people, all we can do is say, well, are they being productive? Are they working on the right things? Are they working enough? But it may be that they're in a system, and by system I mean, like, if developers and testers are in different geographic locations, you're making their jobs a lot tougher. So they may be doing the best they can do, but it also may be impossible for them to do the job as they should do that because of the ecosystem you put them in. So yes, the people are incredibly important, but the system they're in is what's really critical. And let's take a look at this. And why do I talk about delays? Because the people are busy. There's no question, right? People in the organization are very busy. But if you notice, you'll see, if you follow the work, you'll see that there's a little value add, and then the work waits, and then there's a little value add, and then the work waits, and then there's a little value add, and then the work waits. And the work waits for any number of reasons. Now, we all know this, but we think, okay, so that delays things just a little bit. But it's actually a bigger problem than that. And to avoid it, we have to collaborate across boundaries. Again, this is one of the other guardrails, is how do we collaborate? That we agree to collaborate. So here's the problem with these delays. Week delays interjected here, week delay interjected here, week delay interjected here is not going to be a 3-week delay. You say, wow, we just interjected 3 weeks. But the reason it's not going to be a 3-week delay is because there's the time between the delays. Or when I get requirements and use them, I'm actually going to have to redo them to some extent. Or writing a bug and it being detected. Most devs think they spend a lot of time fixing bugs. They really spend a lot of time finding the bug because time has passed. Two groups getting out of sync. We call those integration errors, but it's really they got out of synchronization is what was supposed to happen. We're just waiting for somebody. So delays actually create additional work. In fact, as much as 80% of the work you do in a lot of organizations is created work from a delay, and that's why we get this slashing. We're almost done, but then we have to look at what's the cause of these. And what can we do? We wait for people, integration, feedback, information, getting it or using it. Sometimes we have it, but we don't use it. So how do we manage this? Well, you've probably heard this phrase. You have to manage work in process. So how do we manage our work in process? That's a key question. First of all, it requires a focus on finishing. We work on small chunks of value. Remember the MBIs, we don't start too many. In other words, we're going to limit the amount we start to the capacity that we actually have of the teams. Now, people tend to start doing this, but then they say, well, there's more stuff to do. So they start other things, and they start working on too many because they say, well, we can't have all these people sitting around doing nothing. But in fact, all that does is overload the constraints. So there are other ways to manage WIP, which is don't start on too much that you've actually started. See, so I want to look at something here. If we start as a regular business capability, we often have what we'll call themes. And what we'll do is, so I've got like a left and a right comparison here, like a theme, and I'll call it, that's a business capability on the left, and I have a business capability on the right. And you'll notice the one on the left is kind of embedded in the theme. And the reason for that is when we just think about like epics and say, okay, I got this theme and here's an epic I'm going to pull out, I'm going to call it a business capability. It's somehow not well enough defined. Whereas if I say, hey, okay, here's our theme. What's our target market? Who are we going after next? Okay, we're only going to worry about these people. These are the most important customers. Of all the scenarios we have, this is what we want to do next. If we have a feature and it doesn't relate to this target market, we're not going to consider it. See, it's a lot better defined because now when you create your features, you're creating your features basically out of the, on the right side, out of the MBI, the target market, things of that nature. Whereas on the left, you're often creating them out of the bigger picture. I'll say, oh, well, I'm in here anyway. We might as well figure out kind of what are the sub features we need. And I have a key down here, which is important to notice that the key here is we have some existing, there are some things to be done, and some things are deferred. If subfeature A2 and subfeature B3 don't work for this MBI that we've limited, then we don't even decompose them anymore. See, we'll actually stop the decomposition. We don't need to get that level. Again, to do this, you need a way to tie the business capability down to the story. Again, tools are useful for this kind of integration. Okay. Again, a new agreement, guardrail, keep WIP, work in process within your capacity. That's actually very important. Okay. And then in addition to this, you've got to make sure you don't do the wrong stuff. I mentioned this already. You've got to use ATDD. Or behavioral-driven design. Now, it's interesting because when I talk about this, some people say, well, we're not even doing TDD yet. Well, the reality is you should learn how to do acceptance test-driven development before you start doing test-driven development. And the reason for that is several-fold. First of all, test-driven development will enable you to build something faster and more economically and maintain it, but you still don't know if you're building the right thing. Extreme programming used TDD, but that was at a very small scale. And that was when you had the customer right there. So in a sense, it was a combination TDD and ATDD in a notion. In large scale, you want to make sure you're building the right thing first. And in fact, in many systems, if you don't have automated testing already, going in and trying to refactor to get unit tests can actually be a little bit risky. Whereas acceptance tests can be wrapped around the entire system. So you always really want to start with acceptance test-driven development, then go to TDD. It's actually a much better way of doing it. A good book on this is Lean Agile Acceptance Test-Driven Development by one of our people, Ken Pugh, if you're interested. So anyway, so the other thing, and this is also something I'm going to go into, is you have to align the ecosystem and completely align the ecosystem. Many people think that if we coordinate and do planning, every 3 months and move forward, and then we have some sort of cadence and synchronization every couple of weeks, that's total alignment. That's a good start, but it's actually not quite enough. Alignment is they have to work together, not just manage their dependencies. If I have one team dependent upon another and they're aware of it, but they work like a sprint apart, you still have a 2-week delay in there. There really needs to be more coordination. Don Reinertson, pretty much considered the guru of Lean, talks about how there's more value created with overall alignment than with local excellence. This is actually a very important concept. You want to visualize the results. A lot of the teams to form their own solutions, but they have to work together. So I'm going to take this one step further now as well. So I talked about minimum business increments. Okay, so you do want to do that. You want to find your business capabilities. And if you can't get the MBIs defined by the business side, then you want on the development side to at least build them in small chunks. So you may not actually release them, but you can at least build them through the scenarios you can imagine. And what you do is you first take, say like here, these might be our epics, and now I create my minimum business increments. But now what I want to do is sequence these in order of importance across the group. It's either the organization or it's across the portfolio. There are a variety of ways of doing this. Again, it's a limit, of really 40 minutes of the heart of the matter that I'm talking about, so I can't go into too much detail. But what you want to do is, what is the business value across the organization? Like in banks, it might be retaining assets, customer experience, lowering costs, government regulations, things like that. every company should identify what is really valuable across the organization, or if you have separate business units across the business unit, and you learn how to sequence according to this. See, then what you do is you break them into features. Now you'll notice I've taken the MBI up here and I've broken it up into features here, and I'm putting all the features of the first MBI before any of the other features, because if I don't build these three, I get no value delivered. If I don't build these four, I don't get any value delivered. I'm not saying you shouldn't break them down further and build them incrementally, but the point is, if I move this one here, say up in between these, then that work is just delaying these. This is the focus on MBIs, is we actually use them to align everything across the organization. In other words, as the stories get split, as the features get split into stories and then get split across, imagine these are different teams. Notice how the stories are aligned back up to the business value up here. So again, you notice the Tasktop thing. This is how you need this kind of alignment. Most tools track one thing here, they track one thing here, they track one thing here. Even if they track the whole thing, they don't give you this kind of alignment. We'll see at the end of this, a Tasktop can. It's really important. However you do it, it has to be done. That's really the key thing. And again, we're going to have some guardrails. You have this work ready to pull. So we're still using a pull system, but when things are ready, we have to have all the work here visible. We have to increase predictability. This is a misnomer in Agile. I hear all the time, we can't do Agile because we need predictability. Well, first of all, in Waterfall, I don't think you have predictability. But perhaps more important, I would suggest a lot of the predictability that we lose, that we don't have, is because we make these plans and then we have how people are supposed to work, and then it doesn't work quite right, that we don't get quite the plan, and we've injected delays into our work. People in Waterfall typically are working on 4, 5, 6 things at once. Like if you're working on 5 things at once, that means 80% of your work is waiting for that thing you're working on at the moment to get finished. These delays create additional work that you had not planned on. I've never been in a planning event where they say, yeah, this will take 6 months, but then we got to add 3 months to it for the work we create by not working on things in sequence. So our unpredictability happens because we're not Agile, not because we are Agile. And people in the Agile world who talk about, well, you can't predict things. Well, you can't predict maybe the specific features, but if you don't have a stable throughput of your teams and your organization, then I would suggest you're doing something wrong. Agile should be way more predictable from a business perspective, although you may not have exact predictability, and you certainly can't enforce like, you're going to get this done at this time. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about throughput of predictability. Okay. And then the next one is the last guardrail, is you want to continuously improve. Again, I'll do a summary of these at the end. So we're trying to align the ecosystem, which is about you work together, you have team structures, you align when teams work. And then, of course, the last thing is you've got to discover your constraints, because your constraints are actually often difficult to actually see. You have everybody working and busy and it's clogged up, but you haven't actually been able to, see where it is. Usually it's somebody who's very critical and very important is busy working. And, everybody's busy working. In fact, sometimes they're working on lots of things because this person isn't there. So if you remember when I talked about the value stream, I had talked about how you could watch the flow of work. Where you have a constraint, although software is really not like a stream itself. It's not a bad metaphor at times. If you think about a stream and you block it halfway, what do you get? You get a backlog of water behind it. If you look at the way you detect constraints, is you find there's a backlog of work behind the workflow. This is why Kanban boards are very useful. Kanban boards are actually a way of mapping your value stream to an actual team board. Again, on our YouTube site, we have a mapping a value stream to a Kanban board that illustrates this. So anyway, we need to actually see everything, and we need to use what we see as a way to detect our constraints. And this is why I think DevOps has gotten to be so popular, is a lot of the times in organizations, the operations is kind of the constraint. And if we can improve that, it's like, we'll unblock the pipeline. But the reality is sometimes DevOps is a constraint, not because they're truly a constraint, but because they're notified way too late. If we recollect that when I talked about what an MBI was, it was really about the whole business value. Well, obviously operations has to be involved right from the very beginning. So this notion of collaboration, one of the guardrails I mentioned, the notion of collaboration has to include everything it takes to get stuff built, not merely, again, the development IT organization. So when we move forward, what we have to do, I don't care what approach you take, but it has to be holistic. It can't be a one-size-fits-all, because even though there are patterns, and even though people have similar problems, the way you solve those challenges needs to be tailored to the organization. So you can start with frameworks, that's fine. Like you may or may not have noticed, we're Safe Gold partners and we use Safe, but we also has to be tailored to some extent to the organization. It shouldn't be something that you just say, hey, here it is, and the question is, where do you start? You also need these agreements across the organization. I'm going to do a quick review, because these agreements have a lot of interesting characteristics to them. So these were the 6 I mentioned. We're saying that however you do it, so this is where the tailoring in a sense can come in. You're not demanding one process across the organization, but you're saying however a group does it, they have to be, everybody agrees to drive from business value. So you can't just throw something in because somebody wants to do it unless you can demonstrate there's business value. You have to collaborate across boundaries. So you can't just say, well, this is what we're working on, or if you look at impediments to that, to collaboration, like sometimes actually HR values are such that they make it so people will focus on some things and not others. So you got to say, well, that's breaking the rule, collaborating across boundaries. We need to keep work in process within our capacity, because if we don't, we create delays. That creates extra work. That pushes our plan out. That makes it worse. We need to increase predictability, because we can't actually coordinate well unless we know stuff's about to happen. That we need to get predictability. We need visibility. And we need to improve continuously. So again, these are things you need to look across the organization, and they're really very, very critical to do this. If you're going to be doing Safe, and I'm mentioning Safe because it's actually one of the frameworks, it's the one we like best. I actually am familiar with things like LESS and Nexus, but they don't take an holistic view, actually. The bottom-up approach to me is not something that I've seen work too well. I've seen a lot of people get stagnated. But one of the key things we have to remember with Safe is that it is a framework, okay? And as a framework, it's not a total solution. It gives you the place for a framework. And this isn't a challenge on Safe or anything like that at all. I mean, Safe is intended as a framework, but how you apply it, how you adjust it, is up to the organization that's doing it. I mean, it is a good thing to, get everybody across the board trained in it and move forward, but how do you actually implement it is a critical piece and needs to be tailored. So I like looking to Safe for ideas, not so much just for well, here's the solution, here's how Safe does it. See, when you say here's how Safe doing it, you're shutting your brain off and you're appealing to something else. You've got to also agree to the guardrails, not just following Safe. That's why we have them as so important. Again, part of the holistic thing is when we talk about a lean enterprise, you have to think, okay, well, a lean enterprise is composed of the business driving it, the team doing the technical work, and you say, what's the role of management? I'm just going to use this graphic here to say a minute about management, because I talked about the ecosystem, and I admit I forgot to say something about management when I did that. So management's kind of been given second shrift in a lot of ways inside the Agile space. And by that, what I mean is that, we talk about, like, when Scrum came out, well, managers they weren't even allowed in the daily stand-ups. We talked about chicken and pigs and things like that, which is kind of interesting because that wasn't really the intent. It was, if people weren't committed to the project, then they don't need to be at this daily stand-up. But managers are often very committed to the project, so maybe they should be there. But the point is, what is the role of management in Agile? It's not just to remove impediments of a team. Because if you remember that diagram I had where I talked about the workflows one way and our people manage another way, the work flowing, who is in charge of that ecosystem? See, that's actually management's role. Management's role is to actually create the ecosystem within which teams can autonomously work. Now, of course, they take input from the teams. Of course, they're not demanding that these be what the teams do. So I'm not saying they tell the teams what to do, But for example, I mentioned the idea of developers and testers not being together. Well, that's a management decision very often. So sometimes we have to undo some maybe bad decisions that we made, or sometimes we have to define we're gonna decide how the teams coordinate, or when, not so much how they coordinate like the method they do it. That's autonomously to the teams, but rather, give them that opportunity. So management's role is this idea of they look to see what's the strategic vision, and then how do they create the ecosystem so it can be implemented. This, by the way, called middle up-down management, and was introduced in the 80s by the same guy who introduced the article that introduced Scrum, called the New Product Development Game, Nonaka.
So Al, thank you so much. You have some great ideas there on how to really focus on business value and alignment and systems thinking. A lot of what you said really resonated with me. The ideas of holistic view, taking a holistic view on all of this, finding and reducing delays, finding and reducing those bottlenecks. The idea that you can't manage what you can't see, the impediments to collaboration. And I really appreciate the fact that you sprinkled the Tasktop dust across your presentation. I think what I'll do now is take a few minutes and kind of illuminate some more of what Al alluded to. So kind of as a reminder, what Tasktop does is to integrate the various tools that software delivery teams use in order to do those sorts of things, remove the bottlenecks and efficiencies, drive further collaboration and alignment, as well as collect the information about the activities in the value stream so that you can see the visibility across the entire process. So you can manage because you can see. So this is another rendition of that slide that's in the lower left-hand corner. This time with the individuals and the tools that they use and the artifacts that they create. Now, what's interesting to me here, of course, I tend to focus a lot on the tools, but each of these disciplines have these specialist tools that they use to create their work products. And they're terrific tools. They are designed in order to really make each of these disciplines much more effective. And they're also designed to help them create artifacts, design artifacts that they are explicitly building to share information with their other colleagues. So, for example, this flow of information that I have here, there may be a PMO in your organization that might be using a PPM tool like CA Clarity PPM. Once the funding is created and business epics are generated in that tool, those artifacts may flow over to the business analysts or product managers who elicit those requirements, describe the features, and they may use specialist tools like Doors, JAMA, Blueprint. They send that information to the developers and testers. Developers use their Agile planning tools like Jira, CA Agile, the former Rally, version 1, LeanKit, RTC, TFS, and others. Testers who, in spite of the fact that testers are meant to be on the same Scrum development team, in a large company, they're more than likely using another tool than the Agile planning tool in order to manage their work. Tools like HP's QC, Tricentis, or Zephyr. And there are a host of other tools that are involved, and a host of other disciplines that are involved. Now, while this animation shows kind of a natural flow of work down the value stream, so what I just described was kind of a natural flow of work. But the sad truth is, because these tools are not integrated, this natural flow of work is quite a bit broken. Instead of the information just flowing automatically from one tool to the next, it's a very manual process. And you're familiar with this, I'm sure. One colleague will export their information from their tool and send it to another colleague, probably an email. And the receiving colleague will rekey this information in their tool, because after all, they need that information in their tool in order to do the work. Now, remember how Al mentioned that it's key to collaborate across those boundaries. Now, when you think about it, while our various specialized tools are great for improving the productivity of each of these disciplines and how they do their work, the fact that they are not integrated actually inhibits this collaboration across the boundaries. So to get back to what Al was saying earlier, when he illustrated the flow of work from business capability down to the backlog, how do all those work items get on that development team's backlog? The chances are the backlog is managed by an Agile planning tool. And chances are also true that they're manually entered, right? So the requirements from the BAs, the defects from the testers, the trouble tickets from the service desk, security issues from security testing tools, they all get manually entered to the Agile planning tool. And that's just one example of how this flow is broken. Collaboration is broken, and that visibility is broken. It's a very manual and error-prone process. It's really time-consuming and frustrating, and a waste of time when this really can be automated. And this is really what Tasktop does. We bring this animation to life. We automate the flow of the artifacts from one system to the others, removing the manual work and the waste that it represents, and creating a frictionless flow of information across the value stream. Because we're also a witness to all this activity, we can actually provide greater visibility across the value stream too, because we can actually keep track of the flow of these artifacts and the relationships across these artifacts, which, as you know, is in essence the traceability across these artifacts. And we create a database of activity data, consolidating all this information into one database so that you can create consolidated dashboards and reports that actually let you see where things stand and where to find those bottlenecks. So we refer to this as value stream integration. Flows nicely into what Al was saying about creating value and the value stream. We automate the flow of the artifacts across the value stream, reducing wasted time and the errors and the drop balls, really increasing cross-organizational collaboration. We provide this ability to increase visibility. And because these tools are rather loosely coupled together, you can adopt the tools that you see fit without fear that that by taking one out or adding another in, you'll have to undergo this huge integration effort. It creates a very responsive value stream toolchain in order to have a responsive value stream. I think I'll wrap up right there so that we can entertain some questions.
So the first question is, can you imagine that a low-level initiative could be successful to apply these thoughts initiated by developers, system engineers, etc.?
If the development team is self-contained, then you can actually have success. But if you're working across the organization, actually going from the bottom up, I don't think works very well. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't try going as far as you can. What I would suggest is you track all the impediments you have. Again, you could still follow the guardrails within your constraint. Make your work visible. Make it clear why you're not as fast as they'd like you to be. Like, this is the amount of time we spent because we weren't able to integrate with other teams, or this was the challenge we had because of, not integrated with testers or things like that. So people make bad decisions very often because they don't have the right information. You're the people who know what that right information is. So if you're starting in a less than ideal state, the question is to ask yourself is, what information do they not have that we know that if they had, they would actually do something differently? So that's how I would attend to that. But the chances of a starting at the team level, you're just going to improve the team. That's good. Do that. But then look to see what else is in your way.
Great. And then another question is, we are already using SAFe at our organization and are already coordinating teams on a sprint basis. What are you saying that is differently than this?
Okay. Now, that's a great question, because the difference is this. Imagine you've got a component team that is giving 20% of their capacity to another team. And in SAFe, what you would do, and I'm not saying you don't use SAFe, but you can do this within SAFe. What you would do then is you would have the component team, see, well, what are the dependencies that they have that are on us, and then they would, of course, put that in their sprint. And then at the end of like sprint 2, they would get their thing done, so that on sprint 3, the other team could get their work done. And that's kind of the standard way of doing it. But what happens is, if there was a misunderstanding of the requirement, then what happens is after sprint 3, when they find out it doesn't work, they go back to the component team, and now in sprint 4, they've got to fix it up. Notice the delays that are going on there. Remember, I talked about alignment and working together at the same time, not just across sprint boundaries. Sometimes what you can do is actually have people on the component team, is there a way I can get better value streams, get better release trains, so that the people on the component team is actually working with the team that's going to use it during the same iteration and working together on getting it done. It's a much finer result. It also means that, in fact, you're clear that we're working on this feature of this team before another feature of another team along the orders of the MBIs. So when you have teams just have their own backlog and they're just ordered how they choose to do it, what you often get is you might actually, if the team doesn't get everything done, they might actually get something done for a team that's working on an MBI that's not as important as a team working another team working on a different MBI. So this alignment all the way back to the top of what can be released, not just what feature is being built, is a critical alignment method that we don't see in SAFe. Now, can you do this in SAFe? Absolutely. Remember, SAFe's a framework. But there's a lot of subtle product management stuff where SAFe can be improved after you get it up initially.
Great. And Betty, a question came in that is, what is the difference between Tasktop and other tools such as Jira, Confluence, Bamboo, etc.?
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah, those tools are the tools that practitioners and managers use to do their work, whatever aspect of the process that is. What we provide is an integration layer on top of those tools that bring them all together, that synchronize the artifacts across all of those tools so that everybody's working in the tool that they want to use, and yet they're all communicating using the current information without a lot of manual effort.
And one more question. Could you talk more about the kinds of increased visibility we should expect beyond the constraints?
Yeah, so there's a variety of visibility. Anything you're working on should be in the backlog, whether it's of value or not. A lot of people say, well, I'll only put it in there if it's of value, like if it's a story or something like that. But a lot of times people are working on things that's kind of shadow work, so to speak. So when you commit to making all work visible, it means you're going to make all this shadow work visible. And that's a funny phrase, maybe. I think some of you are familiar with it. But it's what's being done under the cover, so to speak. And it's very often for devs or testers to say, no, I'm not going to do that because I'm supposed to work on this. That can be a career-limiting move, as we joke. But if you say, well, that's fine, I'll do that, but then it gets on the backlog, it's very important. I've gone into a lot of organizations where I say, is everything on your backlog that people are working? And they say, oh, absolutely. The management, sure, it's there. But then when I talk to the teams, a good 30, 40% of the work that they're actually doing is not on the backlog at all, but is due to shoulder taps and, email interruptions, things like that. And if you're not tracking it and your productivity is low, it's hard to explain why. If you do track it, this goes back to that first question about what if I start at the team level. A lot of times teams' problem is that they have all this shadow work being forced on them. People aren't trying to be mean to you. They just often don't know it's there. So if you make that visible, that is visibility of what each person is doing. But again, let's go back to DevOps. Remember, the problem with ops a lot of times is they're not aware of what's going on until the very end. So if you make all work visible, it also means that as an ops person, I can see everything that's coming my way. I don't get these last-minute surprises. Or if I'm in one group, one program versus another, then that's, I can see that. By the way, I'm going to tie this question back to that question about, well, we're doing SAFe and we're already aligning and things like that. So SAFe is really usually often well done at the program level. But part of the question is, how do you manage shared services across multiple programs? And of course, there are methods to do that. You have in SAFe, you have Kanban, you have shared service leader, things of that nature. But very often when we talk about an MBI, we have to be clear that a minimum business increment is often going to run across multiple programs. And in the shared services, this means that I'm being hit from different directions. We call this the many-headed monster because it's like everybody's telling me I've got to do stuff. Where's the visibility for that? Where's the visibility across the organization as what's truly important? This is in the portfolio management area. And how do you manage that? How do you make that visible? That is often the work that holds that last bit from being done. So if you want to look at where you're doing, and what I'm suggesting is I'm saying that I'm talking about taking it to the next level. Where are there delays? And that sometimes it says, well, of course that has to be there. It seems inherent. But I'd suggest it doesn't have to be, that there are management methods about that. And as you can see, we put up the contact information. I'm real happy if anybody has particular questions or wants some assistance to shoot me an email. And I mentioned some resources. I can, we'll send out a follow-up email pointing out where those are. But hopefully that helps answer those questions as well.
Of course, there's also kind of the cross system visibility as well. So the notion that you would be able to keep track of cycle time, understand really when you start that business increment, perhaps, and when you know that it's gone into production, the traceability of that as well, so that you can see all of the handoffs along the way.
Thank you all for attending, and that will conclude our webinar.